This right, which sets the whole conception of the relationship on a new basis, must often be fought for, since it is felt that, like the right to make payment in money, it is a step on the way towards a dissolution of the entire obligation. The authors of the Doomsday Survey characteristically selected terms for the peasants who replaced their sockages by regular money payments, which were intended to show that they were neither totally free nor totally subordinate. For a long time, however, the names of the money levies continued to reveal their origin in payments in kind, kitchen tax, barrel money, lodging money, instead of the provision of accommodation for the lords of the manor and their officials as they traveled around, honey tax, etc., were all levied. It is often the case, in a transitional phase, that the original payment in kind was estimated in money and that this sum was demanded as a substitute. This transitional phenomenon also occurs in relationships that are far removed from the example dealt with here. In 1877 in Japan, all levies and taxes were still either paid in rice or calculated in rice and paid in money. Similarly, under Elizabeth I, the rent for certain estates belonging to the universities was fixed in terms of corn, although payment was apparently made in silver. At least the identity of the value of the obligation is still emphasized in this manner, but any personal bondage resulting from rigidly fixed contents has already been thrown off. If the ius primi noctis had really existed anywhere, then its development would have followed analogous steps. Every one of the feudal lord's rights extended to the whole of the obligated person who had to forfeit his most fundamental possessions, or rather his being. This would have been the price at which the lord would have granted his female subjects the right to marry. The next stage is that he grants this right, which he can deny at any time in exchange for a sum of money. The third stage is that the lord's veto as such is abolished and the subject is now free to marry if he or she pays the lord of the manor a fixed sum, bride wealth, marriage money, bridal money, etc. Personal liberation is certainly linked with money, though not exclusively at the second stage, since the approval of the lord of the manor still had to be won and could not be attained by force. The relationship is completely depersonalized only when no factors other than money payment are involved in the decision. Before the abolition of every right of this nature that the lord of the manor possesses, personal freedom cannot rise any higher than when the obligation of the subject is transformed into a money payment which the lord of the manor has to accept. Consequently, the reduction and eventually the complete replacement of peasant services and payments frequently took place through their transformation into sums of money. This connection between a payment of money and liberation can perhaps be regarded by the person entitled to some service as being so effective that he himself suppresses the liveliest interest in cash payments. The transformation of peasant sockages and payments in kind into money levies took place in Germany from the 12th century onwards, and the process was interrupted simply because in the 14th and 15th centuries the feudal lords also fell prey to capitalism. For they realized that payments in kind were far more elastic and susceptible to arbitrary extension than were money payments, which, once they had been quantitatively and numerically fixed, could not be altered. This advantage of payments in kind seemed, in their eyes, great enough to make them seize it in their greed at the moment when otherwise money interests were predominant. It is precisely for this reason that people were completely unwilling to allow the peasant to become rich. The English copyholder was not generally allowed to sell any cattle without the special permission of his lord. For by selling cattle he obtained money with which he could acquire land elsewhere and extricate himself from his obligations to his previous lord. The greatest step forward in the process of liberation is achieved through a development within money payment itself when a single capital payment replaces the periodical levy. Even if the objective value is identical in both forms of payment, the effect upon the human subject is quite different. As we have pointed out, the various payments levied certainly give the obligated person complete freedom in terms of his actions, provided that he obtains the money required. But the regularity of the payments forces such action into a fixed scheme, imposed by an alien power, and so it is only with the capitalization of the payments that the form of all kinds of obligations is attained which corresponds to the greatest personal freedom. Thus, it is only with the capital payment that the obligation is entirely converted into a money payment. Money levy with its regular recurrence still preserves at least a formal element of bondage over and above the value required in payments. This distinction is manifested in the following manner. In the 13th century and later the English Parliament often decided that the counties had to provide a certain number of soldiers or workers for the king. The representatives of the counties, however, regularly replaced the provision of men with a money payment. But no matter how much personal freedom was saved in this manner, there is a fundamental distinction between this and the rights and freedoms that the English people purchased from their monarchs through single votes on money. If the person receiving the capital is then freed from all the insecurities to which he is subjected in the case of individual levies, then the corresponding equivalent on the side of the obligated person is that his freedom is converted from the unstable form that it possesses when recurrent payments have to be made into a stable form. The freedom of the English people with regard to their monarchs depends partially upon the fact that, by means of capital payments, the people had settled matters with their king once and for all with respect to certain rights. A document from Henry III states, for example, pro hac concession dederent nobis quintam decimam partem omnium mobilium suorum. It is not in spite of but precisely because of the fact that such an agreement concerning the freedoms of the people reveals a somewhat brutal, external and mechanical character that it implies the most complete antagonism contrary to the feelings of the king that no piece of paper should come between him and his people. Yet precisely for this reason it also constitutes a radical abolition of all the imponderables of more emotional relations which, when freedoms are attained in a form less tied to money transactions, often provide the means for revoking them or making them illusory. A good example of the gradual development in which the substitution of money payment for payment in kind secures the liberation of the individual is revealed in the obligation upon subjects, citizens and copyholders to accommodate and feed their monarchs, civil servants, patrons and manorial lords in the course of their travels. This burden stemmed from the old service to the monarch and achieved great significance in the Middle Ages. The first step towards an objectification and depersonalization of this obligation occurs when it is strictly defined. Consequently, we can find, even at an early date, an exact specification of how many knights and servants have to be accommodated, how many horses and dogs can accompany them and how much bread, wine, fish, dishes, tablecloths, etc., must be provided. Nevertheless, the moment that accommodation and feeding were actually required, on the one hand the limits to the services provided must easily have become vague and, on the other, such services definitely reflected the character of a personal relationship. In contrast, we are dealing with a more developed stage when we find that mere deliveries of payments in kind took place without any accommodation. In such cases, the measurement of the quantity could be much more precise than if people had to be accommodated and their appetites satisfied. We learn, for instance, that Count von Rysek was to receive a certain payment of corn. From this corn bread must be baked for his retinue when he is in the village of Krotzenburg so that he will not molest or harm the poor people in the village any further. Another consequence of this development is that fixed money payments are stipulated for the occasions when people of high rank appear on their travels or at court sessions. Eventually even the variable and personal element that is still present here is removed when these services are commuted into permanent levies which are imposed in the form of subsistence money, master's daily allowance, mercenary money, even when the former official journeys of the judges, etc.